Hi everyone, Melissa here. So excited to kick off our Fall Girl Talk series today with a really important conversation on the state of girls. The world has come together online for the 75th UN General Assembly, and the world looks very different for girls today. And gender equality is even more important as we all kind of deal with the situation, the global pandemic, and the state of things. So we're excited to have our conversation today to talk about all of the ways that girls are impacted and also kick off our Girl Talk series going into this fall, where we will talk about the issues that are most important, things like civic action, gender-based violence, and really digging into the impact that COVID is having on girls and women around the world. So I'm so excited to kick us off this morning and this afternoon, wherever you are turning in the world this evening, with our first speaker. A friend of mine and colleague, José Roberto Luna, is the technical specialist for youth and adolescents at the UNFPA. José Roberto, we're so happy to have you today. Happy to have you as a male champion for girls, for youth, and for gender. And I'll let you tell us about the state of girls.
Thank you, Melissa. And I'm so happy and grateful to be here with you in this conversation today, because, this year also, along with the General Assembly that you mentioned, last year, it was the 25th anniversary of the ICPD, the International Conference on Population and Development. And this year we are, also celebrating the 25th anniversary of Beijing. These two main platforms and agreements and conferences are providing for us, the benchmarks for gender equality around the world. And, Cairo was established, all the bases and foundations for working with adolescent girls, and Beijing reinforced, strongly that vision that if we really want to achieve, gender equality and transform the world, the voices and rights for adolescent girls should be there. And, just to provide this panoramic, view, this overview about the situation of adolescent girls, we have to remember that even if we, have achieved some, progress around the world since 25 years, we're still facing many challenges, and the access to education for girls is one of them. And today we know that more than 163 billion of young people are out of school, and with COVID-19 this could be exacerbated. In 2016, UNESCO was estimated that 130 million girls between 6 and 17 years were out of the schools, and primarily in sub-Saharan Africa. So even if we are talking about gender parity in many places around the world, we're still facing lots of challenges to provide access to the right to education for many adolescent girls. And something that is really connected with this problem is the reality of child marriage as a harmful practice. We know that around the world, 650 million women and girls have been, married in childhood. And today around the world, 1 in 5 girls, still are being married around the world, in childhood. And even if we know that this is a human rights violation and many countries are changing laws, the practice remains, widespread. And in developing countries, there are countries with more than 40% of, prevalence. And, we are seeing disparities also, in the progress. For instance, in Latin America, in the last 25 years, the numbers remain, the same without, reflecting any progress. Also, in terms of adolescent pregnancies, every day in developing countries, more than 20,000 girls under age of 18, are giving birth. And this amounts, to more than 7 million births per year. And, also, how this is changing everything in terms of, their lives and their present and future. Also, we know that young people, and particularly, adolescent girls and young women are, facing so much struggles to access to contraceptives that are related to their capacity and bodily autonomy. They have higher rates of unintended pregnancy than any other age group, and the unmet need for contraception is higher among adolescents compared to other, uh, women groups, and generally, they are reflecting higher unmet need for contraceptives around the world. And this is also connected with, abortions, unsafe abortions, and other, risks related to their, development as a whole. And we know that the COVID is really, increasing all these, inequalities and challenges for young people, and adolescent girls are not the exception. So for instance, UNFPA, at the beginning of this pandemic, did a modeling exercise based on data coming from the countries. And, the data is showing that in terms of family planning, some around 47 million women in 140 low and middle income countries would be unable to use modern contraceptives. And for every 10 months of the lockdowns, if the lockdown continues, we will expect to have 2 million additional women that may be unable to use modern contraceptives. Also, in terms of gender-based violence, if the pandemic continues, if the lockdowns, continues for 6 months, we can expect, these are projections, right? 31 million additional gender-based violence cases. And of course, adolescent girls are part of these numbers. And for every 3 months, the lockdown continues, we can expect additional 15 million additional cases of gender-based violence. Also, in terms of female genital mutilation and child marriage, due to the pandemic, we can expect 2 million female genital mutilations, cases may occur. And also we can expect that 13 million child marriage could take place, that without the pandemic wouldn't have, occurred between 2020 and the 2030, where, the development agenda is expected. Also, we know that all these, campaigns and efforts that we are doing to keep the programs and the conversations and the gender equality moving forward are trying to use the internet and improve education using digital platforms. But we know that also the access for, internet is not the same for everyone. For instance, women have less access than men to internet, and, around the world, 70% of young people have access, but in developing countries, especially in Africa, only 40%, are having access for distance education. In terms of access to work or employability, before the pandemic, the World Bank, estimated 1 billion of young people would be, ready to enter the labor market, but without any kind of access to opportunities. And now, with the pandemic, it's expected that 600 million of young people will be looking for jobs, and they wouldn't, be able to find any opportunity. Also, we have to remind, and recall that young people living with disabilities, they have, 3 times more likely to experience different forms of violence than, persons without disabilities. And of course, they will have more challenges to get access to services, to opportunities, and agency to really take care, not only for their health, well-being, but for also be safe during this pandemic. And we know that particularly for adolescent girls, there is another element that we have to take into account. Many, adolescent girls are facing what we call period poverty. That, is, how adolescent girls are struggling in low and middle income countries to get access to menstrual products, and this is related to their dignity and human rights, but also for, their sexual health as a whole. And we know that adolescent girls are also struggling with power relations and lack of voice and agency. So this year, for instance, the the International Day of the Girl is calling for, how the voices of adolescent girls can contribute to gender equality. And that's why what you are doing, keeping your participation, voice, and actions in your clubs is not only critical, but also transformative to really create a movement in favor of gender equality. And as UNFPA, you can see, my background picture is, the cover of our global strategy, My Body, My Life, My World, because we really want to contribute to create a world where, every single adolescent girls can have access to agency to take decisions over their own body, to be able to really make decisions around their lives, and also to contribute, by having the right to participate, in those elements that are critical for your lives, transforming your world. So thank you so much. And I'm wishing you to have, a very nice conversation, and using this data just to recognize that adolescent girls are also different. And we would like that every single adolescent girls can have access to all the rights and well-being as they deserve. So thank you so much for this space, and wishing you a very nice and critical and profound conversation. Over to you.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to our virtual panel series. It's so exciting that you've all decided to join us today. There is nothing better than hearing from young women who are changing the world and tackling some of the most pressing issues like dwindling healthcare resources, a lack of education, the destruction of communities by climate change. I'm just so honored to be in the presence of 3 incredible women who are working on behalf of Girl Up and are going to be sharing their experiences from around the world. So before we kick it off and introduce our wonderful panelists, I just wanted to remind everybody that there is a Q&A function, and we're going to have time for you to ask your questions. So please use that. Put your questions in there. I will make sure I get to them. You can start, even now. And as we sort of continue the panel session, and then the last 15 minutes, I'll really make sure we dedicate time to answering each of your questions. So without sort of any further delay, I would like to hand over to each of our panelists just to quickly introduce yourselves and a little bit about who you are and what you do, and then we'll kick off the session.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction. My name is Shania, and I am a current Girl Up Teen Advisor. I am also the coalition leader for the Girl Up Southeast Texas Coalition, and a very passionate advocate for gender equity. And I really emphasize my advocacy through an intersectional lens and ensuring that all voices are heard.
Fantastic. Welcome, Shania.
Hi everyone, my name is Trisha Venkatesh, and I'm also a Girl Up Teen Advisor this year, based in Bangalore in India, where it's currently almost 10 in the night. Apart from being the founding president of the Girl Up Club at my school, I also co-lead an organization called Igniting Youth that works to provide resources to youth across South Asia to engage in conversations about taboo social issues and then work to actively combat them in their communities. And I'm really honored to be on this panel today, and I can't wait for the conversation.
Fantastic. Well, welcome, Trisha. So everybody, just to let you know, I think Jacqueline might still be trying to get in or is not able to get in, but as soon as she's in, I'll be notified and we will give her an opportunity to introduce herself. But in the interim, we're going to kick off the panel. So my first question for both panelists is to maybe share a little bit about, how the current public health and political climate is affecting gender equality around the world. What are you seeing, and how is it showing up in terms of your experiences of gender equality? So Trisha, I don't know if you want to go first, not to pick on you, but maybe you can start us off.
Yeah, so I definitely think that as a result of the public health crisis that is COVID-19, in India in particular, I saw that as we went into lockdown for several weeks because of the situation, there was an increase in domestic violence in a lot of households targeting adolescent girls. There was also an increase of child marriage, which could result out of financial desperation or having to take daughters out of school and having marriage be the only other option. There's also an increase in demand for girls to do the housework. I know friends of mine that have families in rural areas where even though the whole family was locked inside the house, it was still just the women that were expected to do the housework every single day. And girls' education is, of course, at risk, as José Roberto said in his introduction. They do have less access to technology, and I know that in a lot of rural communities where there is limited access to these resources, it is the education of the sons that are prioritized over the daughters. And there's also been issues with access to menstrual care and contraceptives and reproductive care as well, which is also affecting women. So that's how I think the public health situation has affected girls. And Shania, over to you.
Thank you, Trisha. And yeah, I definitely agree with what Trisha is saying. The COVID-19 crisis really made visible the barriers that women face all around the world, and it even worsened it to an extent. In terms of gender-based violence, like Juan was saying, it really, now women and young girls are to stay home. They couldn't leave their homes to prevent from contracting COVID-19. And now there's the potential of them facing domestic violence or the lack of access to education because of, the lack of technology. And in addition to that, also, when we look at varying identities, for example, old women, now they face, this COVID-19 crisis already on top of the gender-based violence they may face, or, just the overall gender equities within their communities. And then when you look at young women around the world, now it's their education that is in question. Now they're unable to go to school if they stay at home. Maybe they don't have access to, reproductive care like contraceptives or, menstrual products like pads and tampons. So we see that COVID-19, affects everyone, and in particular for young women and girls, it's really exposed what they face. And in the light of that, it's also brought more awareness to these issues. For example, for me, I'm Venezuelan, and in Venezuela, gender-based violence has really been an issue with the socioeconomic crisis. And now with this COVID-19 pandemic, it, really has worsened it. But, there has been advocacy around that issue, and a lot of news outlets have been bringing more awareness to that. And so we see that, although there is so much conflict and difficulty, that people are still listening and people are being made aware of what women face.
I have never been more intimidated by these incredible responses and just the work that you're doing. It's so incredible to hear it. It's really inspiring. And I think, in some ways, listening to your responses, it can be quite upsetting, but I think at the same time, seeing how you are undertaking work to tackle it, which we'll get to in a minute, I think is really important. Because, certainly for everybody joining in, I'm hoping, we can also look at what each of us can do to tackle these important issues and, importantly, what the work is of Girl Up in addressing them. So I know for a lot of people hearing it might seem overwhelming, but stick with us. We're going to get to the solutions in a minute. But before we do, I just wanted to introduce Jacqueline, who's managed to join us. So Jacqueline, welcome to the panel. And I just wonder, for people who may not have met you or know your work, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little bit of an intro as to who you are and what you do for Girl Up.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to finally join you guys. I was having some technical difficulties, but welcome to everyone. My name is Jacqueline Malombe, and I am a club president from Malawi, which is in Southern Africa. And I am very passionate about working with the girls from different backgrounds, especially during this very difficult time. And we have been focusing mainly on issues to do with SHRH and also gender-based violence. And we have been working with them because now that we are within this pandemic, resources are even harder for them to come by, and everyone is struggling financially. So we have been trying to talk to them about what they can do, especially because of all the, as you said also, that COVID-19 has really just highlighted some of the issues that we're facing. Not only has it highlighted, it has magnified. So we are just working with them in different ways to see how we can help them, especially to get through the issue of marriages, which has really increased, especially in this part of the world. We just hear so many headlines of all these girls getting married because they're not in school anymore. So that is the work that we've been doing. And thank you so much once again, Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline. I mean, Jacqueline, while I've got you, can you share with us a little bit about one of the issues that you're most interested in that you see intersecting with gender equality, and that's sort of really relevant to your work?
Okay, I think the first thing that comes to mind is Malawi has a lot of high school dropout rates among the girls, and they have a very low attendance as well. And when we figure out why this is happening, for some people, it's because they come from a household that just doesn't believe girls should be educated, and others want to go, but they lack the resources that they need during their menstrual period. So it's very interesting to me because those facilities, I believe, should be free because it is no one's choice to menstruate, and they can be so expensive in the stores. So I think the work that has been done, girls, recently has now shifted the focus to either menstrual cups or reusable pads. And my group especially, we've been working with different sponsors and fundraisers to see if we can raise money for reusable menstrual pads for girls so that they can go to school and attend the full duration of their classes.
I think that's, you know, it's such an important point in terms of how do we remove some of the barriers, right, to young women accessing education. So thank you for that. And Shania, you know, over to you. I'm really interested from your perspective, which sort of issue do you see intersecting with gender equality that's really relevant to your work?
For sure. So for me, here in the United States, the November election is at a really critical moment, and with the election less than 6 weeks away, civic engagement to me is incredibly crucial in these moments. For me, what that looks like is understanding how important it is to be civically engaged, whether that's educating ourselves on political candidates, whether that's understanding the structures of government and how it is that we elect the people that represent us. And then in addition, it's also understanding how that plays a part in our own communities. Because, you know, although politics and elections are one facet of social change, it's also up to us to act within our own communities to raise awareness about these social issues. So it's definitely, you know, encouraging young women and girls to speak on issues like that they're passionate about, making sure that, you know, we understand that yes, our votes are incredibly important, but in the end, that does not lead to systemic change. We ourselves have to understand what that requires, and understand that, you know, we cannot rely on political representatives for that change, that we ourselves have to ask ourselves, you know, what we can do within our own spaces, you know, to push for that systemic change. For example, with the issue of systemic racism in this country, you know, with the movement for Black lives, it's been really critical for everyone to reflect and to learn more about the Black experience, but also understanding that it's a privilege to just learn about it rather than experience it. And so it's really critical for young women and young girls to be active in their communities, to, you know, use their voice, whether that's speaking with the school board or their, you know, state board of education, or even, you know, at the national level. And that's really what's going to lead to this change and allow us to further advocate for gender equity.
Oh, that is so powerful. I'm sure there's plenty of people watching this high-fiving you, because, you know, it really is a privilege to do this work, and we don't talk about that enough, you know, rather than being on the receiving end of it. So thank you so much for sharing that and your views around it. And Trisha, you know, for you, could you share a little bit from your perspective as to what issues are intersecting with gender equality?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, I think one of my biggest passions is climate change and working to help protect the environment. For those of you that are unfamiliar, in the city I live, Bangalore, it's known for its awful traffic, and that has resulted in really high levels of pollution, whether that's waste or air pollution as well. When I used to go to school, we would always pass by this lake that was really contaminated with a lot of foam. So I think I experienced the consequences of not protecting and caring for the environment based on the city that I live in. And so for that, I think it's really important to mobilize girls to care for the environment. I think, as we'll talk later, there is an intersection between gender equality and climate change because the crisis is going to disproportionately affect girls. As for the things that I've been doing in COVID-19 related to this issue, a few months ago, the Indian government released something called the EIA 2020, which is the Environmental Impact Assessment. And there was a lot of concerns, and youth across India kind of burst out in protest because it basically allowed the construction and infrastructure projects to be regulated without any concern given to its environmental impact. And so I definitely did my part in emailing local decision makers to not pass this act. And I've also worked on local lake restoration projects, raising funds to help restore communities that live by lakes as well. So that's what I have been doing and what I care about.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. And I think it's so incredible to see, you know, the important role that gender equality plays in enabling you know, the solutions to tackling some of the most pressing issues we face globally, right? I always say, if you can solve gender equality, you can tackle all the other, you know, sustainable development goals. So I think this is just such a great example of it, hearing from you all from around the world. So Jacqueline, you know, turning to you, you shared before some of the barriers young women face, you know, entering school. And I just wondered, you know, what have you really learned about how to tackle these issues during the pandemic and, you know, some of the challenges that women are experiencing? Have I lost Jacqueline? No, she's there.
Hello?
Okay. Hey, Jacqueline.
Yes, I'm here. Hello. I can say that what we have learned is, first of all, that these issues should continue to be tackled, but that we should look at maybe taking a different approach. Because we have gotten the chance to speak with some girls who have not had an equal opportunity to get an education. And what we find out is really shocking, because you'd think that things happen in an unsystematic way, that there's no one governing some of these things happening, like the high dropouts and the early marriages. But you learn that, you know, there is hierarchy, so each village does have a chief that takes care of the people there. And sometimes that chief is not helpful, or sometimes it's even the girl's parents who will push her towards getting married. And especially in this time, because of the uncertainty of when this crisis was going to end, a lot of parents were probably seeing a financial opportunity in just sending their kids off to get married, since, well, you're not going to school and we don't have any money. And the marriage is seen as a source of income in some communities. So basically what we've learned is that we need to continue doing this outreach and educating people as much as we can. And also we need to start putting in more private organizations, or like more organizations in schools and in communities and even in hospitals, where girls can go and get the necessary guidance, because we do have the barrier of corruption. We have the barrier of parents who do not understand the dangers of marrying their child off at a young age. And so we've just been learning more and more about this, especially now that we've had to question, how come, like, you were enrolled in the school before, how come you're getting married now, especially when the child was actually doing really well in school, or portrayed an understanding of their goals and their vision.
I think that is such an important point in terms of looking at solutions in a different way. And I think, you know, that could really apply to all aspects of how we're approaching solutions to advance gender equality during the pandemic. So thank you so much for sharing that. Just a reminder to anyone who's watching, please feel free to pop your questions for our wonderful panelists in the Q&A. We've got 15 minutes for Q&A. I'll make sure I get to it. So please just put your questions in there. And for Trisha, sort of turning to you now to talk about climate justice. So can you share a little bit about what climate justice is and, you know, why you think it's important to look at it through an intersectional lens or apply intersectional thinking to climate justice?
Yeah, so I think that climate justice is acknowledging the fact that not everyone across the world is going to be affected the same way because of climate change, because of the way our societies are built with the class system in capitalist countries and the urbanization of, you know, different areas. People are naturally not going to have the same consequences, and a lot of marginalized communities are going to be the most vulnerable. I think that some examples of this in like the United States, for example, would be people of color, and the neighborhoods that they typically occupy are usually the areas in which landfills are created or a lot of toxic waste ends up piling up. And so they naturally get into that cycle where they're going to be more negatively affected than upper class white communities. And talking in a more global scale, I think that countries like developing countries are naturally also going to be hit a lot harder than the West. And I think that there's this kind of false idea that even I used to believe a few years ago, that overpopulation in developing countries and development in developing countries is going to contribute negatively to climate change. And even I used to think that, oh, people in India should just stop having so many kids, and then maybe we would solve climate change. But that's not really the case, because when you look at it, the bottom 10 to 20% of India's population is not going to have a carbon footprint nearly as high as the top 5 to 10% living in privileged communities, just because of the difference in lifestyles. And I think acknowledging that in itself is climate justice, and realizing that it is really up to the people in power and the people that are benefiting off of the destruction of the planet to take action. I think climate justice is also realizing that Indigenous communities and Indigenous knowledge systems can be really beneficial when we're talking about the climate movement. Indigenous communities everywhere have spent years in their land, really, you know, cultivating their land, and by kind of claiming their land, globalizing it, and just removing, like taking away their rights, we're not helping ourselves or anybody. There was a concept that I think some governments, they tend to kind of claim tribal lands in order to conserve it for the protection of the environment, but sometimes they end up just planting species of plants that aren't even native to that area, that, you know, damage the local ecosystems there. And so I think that also getting in people from Indigenous communities, people from farming communities, into positions of power where they have a seat at the table to voice their concerns and perspectives would also be really beneficial to implementing more effective climate solutions and policies.
Fantastic. Wow. You give me a lot to think about there. And I think it's all really important. And, you know, just understanding the concept of climate justice, I think is a really important one, because often we assume it works for everybody in the same way, and it doesn't, to your point. So Shania, you know, just from your perspective then, you know, you've talked a lot about civic engagement, and for a lot of people in America, this is a very important time, but I wondered if you can share for sort of our global audience as to why it's important for young women to be engaged in the civic side of life. You know, for a lot of people who might think that's not for me, can you share from your perspective, you know, why civic engagement is so important, particularly for young women?
Of course, you know, there is no place on earth where women have total equity, where women are completely represented. And so civic engagement is a tool for women to rise to that political place where they can be represented in decision making. Because where we are now, you know, there are decisions being made that pertain to women, but women aren't the main decision makers. They're not in the room where those decisions are being made. And so through civic engagement, we can allow this space and allow a means for women to represent our beliefs. And just as Trisha was saying, you know, we need people to be at the table. And we need women to be at the table, and not just women, but diverse women with, you know, varying identities of, you know, different ethnicities, different nationalities, different backgrounds. And that's how we can truly be inclusive when we are making these decisions. And that's the means that we can make sure that, you know, every woman and every young girl is represented, and that they feel like their government is fighting for them, and that their community and their society wants them to succeed and that wants to uplift them, rather than the reality that is now, in which, you know, women face so many barriers to even make their voices heard, you know, for government officials and for community leaders to even listen to them. And so it's absolutely critical, you know, for civic engagement, for women to be represented, and to hold those spaces. That is how we can amplify these issues like gender-based violence, you know, like, you know, child marriage, and like climate change. That's how we can address it at the national level, through which we can see, you know, real policy changes in a way that protects women. Because every young girl and every woman deserves to feel safe, deserves to feel empowered, it deserves to feel, deserves to have an education. And that's, you know, that's why civic engagement is so important, because that's the means that, you know, we can achieve that world in which every woman and every young girl does feel safe, educated, and empowered.
Woohoo! I love it. That's so true. We do deserve it, and you know, we don't say that enough. So thank you. That's awesome. But look, we are inundated with questions. We have about 20 questions. So I'm going to shift now to the Q&A segment. But before I do, I always ask my panelists one question which you would not be prepared for, so I'm going rogue here, which is, you know, if you could leave everyone watching this with one action that they can take to advance gender equality, please can you share it? So just a very short one action they can take. So I'm going to kick it off. I would, and I can say this as an advocate for Girl Up, I really recommend everybody donates to the organization, supports it, and champions this wonderful organization that is advancing gender equality through the power of girls. So please, please do that. But now over to our panelists. I'd love to hear kind of your one action that everybody can take to advance gender equality. Maybe Shania, I don't know if I can jump to you first. That'd be great.
For sure. I mean, for me, it's always education. I think as young women and girls, our education is revolutionary, and, you know, learning and through, you know, that education, we can be leaders in our community. And, you know, we have to recognize that there are so many barriers that women face to even receive an education. So just do what you can to make sure that, you know, young women are educated and that's how they can become these political leaders, and to truly empower others through policy. So I think that's my main takeaway.
Thanks, Shania. And Jacqueline, what's your one kind of fix for equality?
Okay. Well, before I get to that, I'll just quickly like to comment on what Shania just said about civic engagement. And I think that really spoke to me, because currently in Malawi, we are revising our abortion laws, but the main people running that decision are not even female. And I do feel like if women were more civically engaged, we would have a better chance at being at the table. And to answer your question, I think everybody does need to have some sort of responsibility towards their community. And so I'll give advice for that anyone can follow to kind of end this gender-based violence situation that is going on. And I would say just to take the initiative to know more about mental health, to know more how to spot certain behavior traits, and to engage other people in the conversation, because there is a long-standing history of abusers protecting abusers, and people never talking about it, and that shame behind being violated, and that shame behind being harassment, instead of it being used to silence women, it should really be used to fuel the movement and gender-based violence. So that's the advice that I'd give.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And Trisha, what's your views on an action people can take?
I would say that one thing that everyone could do is have a conversation with a boy or a man that you know in your life about gender equality, because I know that, at least in my experiences, everyone that's kind of been on the forefront of feminism or gender equality has mostly been women. And I think that while it is super important to, get more women involved in civic engagement and things, if we want to eradicate gender-based violence, we have to kind of look at the culture and the mindset that is causing it in the first place. And I think that the first step that anyone can take is to really understand the mindset. And so talk to anyone, any guy that you know, about how they approach the world and how they think about things, and try to have a conversation with them too and involve them.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, panelists. And now I'm going to try and get to all these questions. They are literally coming thick and fast. So our first one, and panelists just jump in, whoever wants to answer these, feel free to speak up. So our first question is from Winnie Nagaya. In my country, Kenya, there's an amazing reproductive bill that's being advocated for, one that makes abortion legal, but most institutions, especially the church, the majority are against it. The issue of being pro-choice in so many democracies is not an established idea. What do you think we could do as young women to ensure that women's rights, especially reproductive rights, are respected and not met with so much policing? It's an important question, actually relevant around the world. So how do we stop policing women's bodies? Anybody want to jump in?
I mean, I think abortion is one of those really controversial issues, and that's why it still remains such a big problem, because people are so polarized about it. But I think that we can really do is try to have a conversation, especially with the other side. So I think it starts with raising awareness about what you believe and trying to understand the other side. So you can, try to find similarities in your beliefs and some sort of middle ground.
Thank you.
And,
anyone else?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Just to add on to what Trisha said, it is actually very controversial, and it's important to understand why. So a lot of societies are shifting from a more traditional religious kind of society to one that just is more like scientific, philosophical. I don't know what words to use, but because of that shift in knowledge and because of that shift of having the choice, this is why things like abortion can be very controversial and can be opposed, especially by religious leaders. And I know in the part of the world where I come from, religion is a very strong deciding factor in anything. And I guess what we can do is hope that our voices will be heard, and the more conversations that we have, the more willing some of these people will be to shift views, because every agenda has been faced with opposition, but there's still the opportunity of getting the equity and the equality that we deserve.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jacqueline. Now, over to our next question from Mintira Menk. How can gender equality be reduced in a country like Nepal, where patriarchy is embedded in the socio-cultural system, along with the power lying in the hands of men? So how do you actually disrupt patriarchy? And, using a country like Nepal as an example. It's a big question, but an important one. So I don't know if any of you can share solutions that you've seen work, really focused on the socio-cultural elements.
I can touch on this. So I think from just my experience of understanding how patriarchal systems are disrupted, what I've seen is financial autonomy is really important for women to, be independent and to pursue careers and to pursue a life that is their own. So I think whether that's investing and maybe even funding women-owned businesses, just allowing women to hold that financial autonomy and control. I think that really empowers them to be leaders in their community and empowers them to be able to disrupt this system that, upholds patriarchy. And of course, you know, there are a lot of complexities with that and with the patriarchal system, and a lot of different intersections as it pertains to the economic and the social and the political. But I think for sure, you know, this financial power is really what, you know, can pave the way for more women to break free of that patriarchal system.
Thank you, Shania, for that. And just on to our next question from Roberto Meggs. She asks, what are the most pressing issues impacting girls in your respective countries, and what work is happening to address it? So I don't know if we want to just touch on this briefly. I know we've shared a bit of some of the most pressing issues that you're seeing now, but just a little bit maybe about some of the work and actions each of you are taking to tackle some of those issues. Shania, I don't know if you want to go first. It's just you're on my screen, so I'm just going to pick on you right now.
Yeah, of course, no problem. So for me in my community, I live in Texas, and we're currently working on our sex education curriculum. The State Board of Education, they're making changes. And so I recently testified for the state in front of the State Board of Education in support of comprehensive sex education that is medically accurate, inclusive, and includes information on gender identity and sexual orientation. So I think within the United States, because comprehensive sex education isn't nationalized, that really leads to high teen pregnancy rates, especially for Latinas. Latinas have the highest teen pregnancy rate in the United States. And so this issue is really important to me because it is personal. And I think, you know, advocating within your community and you know, seeing how you can make these changes even to the curriculum, which, you know, also includes consent education, and that intersects with gender-based violence as well. So that's something that, you know, I've really been striving for in my community, and it's definitely something that we can all consider to do within our own.
Thank you so much, Shania. And Jacqueline, just turning to you, can you maybe share some of the work that you're doing to address some of the important issues facing girls?
So in Malawi, it is quite similar to what's happening in Texas, because the biggest issue we've faced is teen pregnancies and marriages, and there have been so many. And so now I do know that the government is more open to introducing comprehensive sexual education in school curricula, because before there was some stigma about it. They just thought if you talk about this kind of stuff, you increase the rate of these teen pregnancies happening, and now they're more open to it, especially because the ages of the girls who are getting pregnant are actually very alarming. Girls as young as 14 years old, and girls from all walks of life. So it is quite similar to what's happening in Texas, and I am very excited. And I hope that the changes they make will be well researched and very effective.
And Trisha, what about you? Can you share a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so I think around March or April, the organization I mentioned at the beginning that I lead, Igniting Youth, we held a conference about the technology gap and how it's really affecting everyone in India as a result, especially women. And to help combat that, we decided to hold workshops for homemakers that are typically mothers that are not financially independent, and teach them kind of basic technology skills. So that's one aspect of the technology gap that we tried combating. And then the other aspect was the kind of dying art of handicraft artisans and their work. So to help kind of sustain their artwork, we helped kind of get them to sell their work online and continue getting financial income during COVID-19. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Trisha. And Trisha, while I've got you, Anita Lau wants to know, when it comes to sort of the climate change crisis and how it's affecting girls, can you share a little bit more about, you know, the very specific impacts that you're seeing and how it's sort of affecting women and girls globally? What are you noticing, and how is this specifically showing up? Have you got any examples you can talk to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that climate change inevitably affects the poorest of the lot, and women constitute about 60 to 80% of the world's poorest population. And especially in developing countries, women make up a lot of the agricultural laborers, which is an industry that's going to be really affected by climate change. And of course, as a result of natural disasters or really any kind of humanitarian crisis, whether that's war or climate refugees or COVID-19, in any time of like emergency, we always see a rise in sexual exploitation of women, and just because of an increase in their vulnerability. So that's another way that as more women become displaced, which around 70 to 80% of the people that are expected to be displaced as climate refugees are also women and girls. So there's going to be a risk of their education as well as their safety in that sense. Also in developing countries, women and girls often hold the responsibilities of things like fetching water, collecting fuels, preparing food, and all of that relies on natural resources and biomass. So all of that is also going to disproportionately affect girls. I hope that answers their question.
No, it does. That's thorough. Thank you. And so look, Shania, we've got a question for you from Dr. Shanley Corallo, who would like to know, what do you believe is the most effective method to organize girls and women to engage in local politics? How do you approach it? This is such an important question. So have you got some tactics you can share with us?
For sure. So at my school, I started the Girl Up Klein Collins chapter, and through that, we started off with just presentations about how our political system works, what it means to be civically engaged, whether that's registering to vote, actually voting, or just making informed decisions within your own community. And so I think the best way to really contribute and build, this environment where people can be civically engaged is really through educating ourselves about particular social issues, and also encouraging young women and girls to, find an issue that they're really passionate about, and show them how that intersects, with politics and with civic engagement. Because I know a lot of girls are, maybe passionate about the gender wage gap. And so we can, speak on how policy can really influence that, or even, maternal pay, and how when women are pregnant and, they don't go to work, are they still going to be paid? And how, policy can influence that. So I think it's definitely acknowledging how, everything intersects with policy and with civic engagement. And that's really a way that you can inspire, young women and young girls, and just people in your community to really take action for it. Because now they see that, this issue is really important to me. I don't know what to do about it. Well, this is a means that, you can really go about making change.
That's fantastic. And so this next question is for all the panelists, and I'm combining two, so I'm going rogue again, so just hang with me. So one of the questions is, what advice would you have for young girls who want to get involved in these conversations and be a part of the change, but maybe don't feel like their opinion would be of any value? So that's the first part of the question. And then the second is, how might you use your social media to amplify the message and maybe get involved? So it's open to all panelists. Please jump in. I mean, the first one just made me feel like, wow, we need to know that all our voices matter. So if you can share a little bit about, how do you get involved if you don't feel valued, and how can you maybe use your platform, whether it's social media, to amplify the message?
I think I could attempt the first one. So I think the first thing you'd like to do is maybe network more, because you do, like these days, I do find a lot more spaces of women and even men who are willing to talk about these things. But before, I do have experiences where it was uncomfortable to talk about gender-based violence or mental health, and no one wanted to talk about it. So the first thing you'd like to do is probably look for a space where that conversation is being had, and hopefully that will build up your confidence. The more you talk to people who want to listen to you, the easier it will become to talk to people who are closed off about the topic. Because I think everyone, no matter how experienced they are, they just have that wave of anxiety when they're like, oh no, probably this audience doesn't want to hear this, or this is probably a taboo topic in this area. So start where the conversation is already happening.
Thank you. That's such an important point. Start with the conversation that's already happening. Great point. Thank you. Shania, over to you. Any thoughts here, comments?
Yeah, of course. For me, one of my favorite quotes is by Audre Lorde, and she says that like taking care of myself is not an act of self-indulgence, it is an act of self-preservation. And so there really does have to be a lot of inner work when you are advocating for change, because you can face burnout. You can feel like you're not good enough to have your voice heard. You don't feel like you're worthy or that you deserve it. And so it's really important to do that inner work, and to do affirmations, or to just, consistently tell yourself that I deserve to be here, I am worthy, I am enough. And, eventually you'll start believing it. And that's really one of the most important parts, is that, you cannot help others if you're not helping yourself. And that your mental health is absolutely so important in this work. And really allows you to learn more about yourself and to really understand how you want your role to be in activism and in changing your community, because that can look like so many different ways. And so it's really important to do that inner work, to really be able to believe that your voice deserves to be heard, and to really make it heard and command that it be heard.
Oh, love that. Thank you. And Trisha, do you want to close us out just with the final response here in terms of how people can get involved, and if they're worried they're not going to be valued, or how do they use social media to get involved? What does that look like?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything that Jacqueline and Shania said. I think that another point could be to look at your other interests and see how that could align with your potential activism for a cause that you care about. Activism and advocacy is not just public speaking, if that's not your forte. A lot of people make change through art, whether that's writing or visual art, music, anything. So just kind of look to your own interests and see how you can portray your voice and share your story through whatever medium that you prefer.
Well, thank you for that. And look, a big thank you to all our panelists and to everybody who's tuned in today. I'm going to hand over to Melissa to close us out, but thank you all so much for your wonderful contribution.
Well, thank you, Michelle, for moderating just such an incredible conversation. And Trisha, Shania, Jacqueline, I'm so proud to be part of this Girl Up community with you. Michelle is a gender equality expert in her own right. And if you haven't yet, you definitely need to check out her book, The Fix. It talks about how these systems are actually set up against us, and we don't need to be fixing women, we need to be fixing the systems. And I think we've heard a lot today about how these systems really play out in so many interesting ways, and how COVID and this conversation of justice is really amplifying and exacerbating so many of these inequalities. I think a couple of the things that I took away from our entire program today, from José Roberto's very important kind of laying out of the statistics of the state, is just how important access is, whether that's to education or to internet, how this sort of equity and access plays out. And we heard from our panelists over and over again how much girls are disproportionately have less access. And I think that that's an incredible takeaway from this conversation. I'm so moved by each of your activism, Trisha, Shania, and Jacqueline, and this idea of justice, whether it's environmental justice or gender justice or civic engagement and justice in our rights and in our laws. Without justice, we can't have equity, and without equity, there is no equality, and that's really what we're fighting for at Girl Up. And so I think this idea is getting incredibly more important, as our conversations deepen and as we expose injustices in so many aspects of our life. So this is not our last Girl Talk. This is our first Girl Talk of the fall. If you liked this conversation, we hope that you will join us for future Girl Talks. You can go to our website, girlup.org/events, and find out more about what's coming up. We are going to dive into the idea of civic engagement, how policies impact us, how representation matters. We heard a little bit of that from Shania. We're going to do a whole conversation about that on October 22nd. not just the US perspective, but really globally, how policies, laws, and those decision makers and power holders really impact all of us. So definitely tune in. I know many people that have tuned in today are new to Girl Up. So if you're looking for ways to get involved, maybe you want to start a club, you need support for getting a club going, definitely go to our website, girlup.org, but also follow us on Instagram at Girl Up Campaign, or on any of the social media platforms that you prefer. We showcase clubs and girls just like Shania, Trisha, and Jacqueline all the time. You can find tons of great ideas and also tons of inspiration. My last plug is that next week on September 30th, we will be celebrating the 10th anniversary of Girl Up. We have a lot of really fun stories to share, calls to action. We're excited to honor the impact of the first 10 years of Girl Up. But also, as you heard today, we have a lot more work to do, and we're really excited to have a growing global community to tackle injustice, inequity, and inequality together. So stay tuned for more about our anniversary. Thank you all again, and we'll see you at another Girl Talk in the future.